present some of our findings and insights from the last 70 or so years of research on this topic. I want to point out too that Scylla is a graduate of our department, and so we're very proud of her and the work that she's doing in moving the state of New Mexico forward on a number of very important fronts. So with that, just a little background. Professor Mike Rocca and I were contracted by the Thornburg Foundation in 2020 to write a report on the implications of legislative professionalism for the state of New Mexico. In the end, we covered about 70 years worth of research on the subject that was published in scholarly books and articles. I should point out too at the outset that I am speaking here as an individual and not as a representative of UNM, although I am employed by UNM as a political science professor. And the contract that we received from Thornburg Foundation was one that was run through the University of New Mexico. So what do we mean by professionalization? Scholars have defined this in a couple of ways. They really sort of add up to the same things. Enhancement of the capacity of the legislature to perform its role in the policymaking process. According to Squire and Moncrief, legislative professionalism assesses the capacity of both legislator and legislatures to generate and digest information in the policymaking process. And so what scholars think of as legislative professionalism is really relates directly to the capacity of the legislature to function as an independent part of the governing system. And there's great variation across the states in terms of each state's legislature to act as an independent policymaking and representative body. And so we'll talk about that. So what it is and what it isn't is an important thing because people, I think, sometimes get confused about legislative professionalism. As Rosenthal details, professionalism can refer either to the attributes of the legislative institution itself or the characteristics of the people who serve in the legislature. Frequently, it refers to both. It should be noted, though, that professionalism is not meant to suggest a degree of competency or skill. Rather, the term is used to characterize the capacity of the legislature and the degree to which legislators' primary career is as a legislator. So professionalism it's not a commentary on the people who are serving in terms of their competence or skill. It's really a reference to the capacity of the legislature as a body to function in the policymaking realm, to function independently, to gather its own information, to be able to, in some cases, ward off special interest groups, and in other cases, to ward off the power and the influence of the executive branch. And so that's about the legislature itself, but then we use professionalism as a way to think about the individual serving in the legislature. And in that sense, we are concerned about or interested in whether legislators think of their primary occupation is as a member of the state legislature. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. And the most important point really is that we're not thinking of professionalism as a sort of commentary on the people who are serving, all of whom are professional people, right? They're all talented people. They've got, experience and educations and life lived experiences that are brought to bear in the legislative process. So it's really not, it's not a commentary on that. It's more about the functioning of the legislature itself. In terms of the main components of professionalism, we look at three variables: salary, staffing, and days in session. Days in session and staffing directly affect the capacity of the legislature to function. Salary, on the other hand, does not. It is something that benefits legislators directly and may indirectly affect outputs by affecting the people who serve. So we make that fine distinction as well in terms of the main components of legislative professionalism. Staffing and days in session is clearly these are two institutional factors, whereas salary is something that primarily redounds to the benefit of the individual who is serving in the office itself. So where does New Mexico rank in terms of these variables? New Mexico ranks 48th out of 50 states in terms of session length, 50th on the question of salary. That's not surprising because we don't pay our legislators an actual salary, and 33rd out of 50 on staff expenditures, and 36 out of 50 in terms of the number of permanent staff that are there to serve the legislature and the legislators themselves. In the end, when you sort of bring all these factors together, we are near the bottom in terms of overall legislative professionalism. So what are the key findings from the work that we did? Legislative professionalism often leads to greater incumbency advantage in elections. This is going to be a mix of positive and negative things. That's what the research shows, and that's what we have reported and what we should sort of understand as we go into this. As an individual resident of New Mexico, as a political scientist, my feelings are that we should seek to advance or modernize our legislature in particular ways. I think that's long overdue. The key findings, though, that we uncovered are a mix of sort of positive and negative things. Greater incumbency advantage in elections, but more contested elections, as more would-be challengers make the effort to contest incumbents, even when their odds of victory are low. More sophisticated and expensive campaigns for office, an increase in the effort that legislators put toward being representatives. Now, that would be thought of, I think, as a positive thing. More effective and capable lawmaking, more effective bargaining with governors, greater ability to oversee the functioning of the executive branch, stronger regulations around lobbying and campaign finance. On the negatives, those are all positives. On the negative side, members of the legislature who might be more focused on re-election than actually legislating. And then greater substantive representation, which is, when we think about representation, we think of it in two ways, primarily. One is descriptive representation. Does the legislature itself look like the population it's designed to serve? And then substantive representation. Do the policy outputs generated by the legislature match up with the core constituencies that exist in the state or the state's population as a whole? So is there a match between policy preferences of the state and its residents and then what the legislature itself actually produces? We tend to find more of that in more professionalized legislatures. So a mix of positive and negative things there, especially in terms of incumbency advantage and campaigns. They're more expensive, but also some substantive things that relate to how the legislature functions in the broader governmental context, especially with respect to governors and their ability to oversee governors in the executive branch and their ability to make laws sort of independent of these outside influences. in the end, what Professor Rocca and I concluded was that staffing is the most important thing that we should focus our attention on, the most important recommendation to enhancing the ability of the legislature to make policy and represent constituents. That staffing is key to this effort. Days in session is second on our set of recommendations. Increasing session lengths will allow the legislature to become more involved in making policy, in shaping the budget, running the government itself. As a result, the legislature will become a constant presence that cannot be ignored by the executive or anyone else, principally interest groups and their lobbyists. Salaries' effect on legislative capacity is not as important as staffing or days in session, but paying people for their work is the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. Salary will affect who runs for the legislature, the time that legislators spend on the job, good government reforms, but the overall effect of salary is less clear than what we see for staffing in particular and days in session. And so those were our primary recommendations. Those were our primary findings from this exhaustive study of legislative professionalism. I should note that in terms of salary, you could increase the legislature's salary and not increase the legislature's days in session, but you cannot increase days in session without also increasing salary. You cannot ask people to work more for $0, I think, in the current context. Others may differ on that. So with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it over to the next speaker. And hopefully that was informative on the basics of legislative professionalism.
Thank you so much, Professor Krebs. That's very, very informative information that I think is important for everyone to, know and understand. I'm now going to turn it over to Mason and Representative Rubio to give us like an overview of how this session went and what the goals and hopes are for upcoming sessions.
Representative Rubio, would you like to start talking about the bill you introduced?
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that. Good evening, everyone. My name is Angelica Rubio, and I represent District 35 here in the city of Las Cruces. This is the 7th year that I've been serving in the legislature, and it's actually the topic that we're discussing today is in fact the reason that I got elected. There are many people in my community, in my district, who for a very long time felt that our legislature is not equitable and not in alignment with many of the values that people in my community believe in very deeply. And so this is one of the main issues that I ran on and won. And so this is something that I've been working on since I first got elected. And so I'm really happy that we are in this position to have this conversation, and that Dr. Krebs and Mason and others are so interested in this effort, because it's been a long time coming to this point. Even before me, I mean, this issue has made it to the ballot, particularly when it comes to pay. I believe it's 7 times, and each time state voters have voted it down. And when I say that, I mean in terms of the constitutional amendment. And for the last couple of years, a cohort of House representatives like myself, there's been about 10 of us who have been working on the 3 things that Professor Krebs was mentioning regarding legislative pay, lengthening our legislative sessions, and incorporating staff into our daily lives. And the staffing piece has already This last session, we voted as a House and the Senate to incorporate funding into to a study for staffing, and it looks like leadership is very much in support of that. And the hope is that by next year we'll have some idea of what that will look like, and how we will either share staff or if we'll each individually have staff. So all of that is being considered right now. I think the RFP went out a couple weeks ago. The second thing is the length of session, which I'll let Mason speak to, but we, before the end of the year last year, prior to this last session, we as a cohort decided, based on the studies that have been done, the work that Dr. Krebs has worked on, and the numerous task force that have happened over the course of the last couple of decades, is that we wanted to do 2 60-day sessions, and removing the governor's power to set the agenda on a 30-day session. That was one of the constitutional amendments that we introduced this past session. It was sponsored and led by Representative Natalie Figueroa. And then myself and Representative Joy Garrett introduced House Joint Resolution 8, which would have worked on repealing the constitutional language within our Constitution that makes it so that we can't receive a salary, and to then establish a commission to establish salaries. And so that was the legislation we introduced this past session. Neither of the bills made it through the House, or the length of session didn't make it through the House. The legislative pay, the salary related legislation did make it through the House, through the Senate. We made it to the Senate Finance Committee with about, I can't remember if it was like 4 or 5 days before the session ended. They gave us a 2-hour hearing in Senate Finance, and then essentially said they weren't going to vote for it. And so I think what we experienced over the course of this last year is that, in my opinion, there is some strong interest in modernizing our legislature. I think that there is some real interest from people that necessarily didn't have the same interest 7 years ago when I first got elected, and brought a lot of these issues to the forefront. I think people are experiencing, legislators are experiencing a lot of dramatic changes within their districts that they are starting to recognize that they can't do on their own. And so I think Professor Krebs is accurate. I think with the study that me and Representative Garrett commissioned last year through the UNM, that's separate from what Professor Krebs mentioned. Staffing is at the top of the list for a lot of legislators, that if we all had staffing, our lives would be a lot less stressful as legislators, but we would actually be able to provide more for our constituents. And so I think that is kind of the foundation of this discussion, is that's where we're getting a lot of leeway with legislators who in prior years may have been opposed to any type of modernization. I think we are moving in a direction where people are feeling a little bit less heartburn about it. The salary piece is still something that I think people privately will say that they support, but there's always going to be this public outcry around paying politicians anything. And I think part of the work that we have to do, not just as legislators, but also as people who believe in good government, people who believe in making sure that we have a legislature that works for our community, that works for the people that we're elected to serve, is that people need to understand we don't actually have a salary. Like, we are doing this purely volunteer. I mean, the time that I'm spending with you right now, the work that I'm helping constituents if they're having issues with their landlords, like there's a number of issues that we encounter every single day that that we are not we don't receive a salary for. And so not only does that leave out so many people with lived experiences to be able to participate in this democracy, but it's also providing that only a small number of people who can navigate the system are holding on to the power that is then not in alignment with what I believe are New Mexican values. And so this is I think the biggest important piece, aside from staffing, is legislative salary. And Professor Krebs mentioned it, that I'm not going to work an extra, so I'm not going to spend another extra 30 days in Santa Fe without without a salary. I mean, it's hard to leave Las Cruces for 60 days already, but then to do it again for another 60 days when we're not getting a salary is really it's really challenging. And so I think part of the work that we have to do between now and the session in January is to do as much education and outreach to our neighbors and to our family members to get them to understand that when we don't have a salary, it's a disservice to our communities, because we can't do more for our communities because we're having to juggle other jobs. And to hopefully get them to support our reintroducing legislation in January to once again pass a constitutional amendment to do legislative pay, or to create the commission, but also to lengthen legislative sessions so that we can put it on the ballot for next November. I think we're at a critical point where we need to get that done next year. Otherwise, we have to wait a significant amount of time to really get the ball going once again. And so I'm happy to answer more questions if you have any. I think for me, this issue is really important because I mean, I'm an organizer by day, and I spend a lot of time with people one-on-one trying to really build community power so that they can change policy to work for all of us. And when we don't have legislators that are reflective of those values, it's really hard to recruit people to run for office. It's really hard to retain the really good legislators that many of us believe are really important to us. And so this is really an equity issue. And my hope is that you can really talk to your community and let them know what we're trying to work towards, and that we have a lot of work to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Rubio. If I can just come in after her. My name is Mason Graham. As Scylla mentioned at the beginning, I'm the Policy Director for Common Cause New Mexico. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the role of Common Cause in this as kind of a political advocacy group, a good government organization, a nonprofit, and community advocates and the work that we do as well surrounding this issue. So Common Cause, we kind of describe ourselves as the organization that represents the people. And someone like myself, and something that we mentioned within Common Cause is that when we participate in the legislature, we act somewhat as like the people's lobbyist. And so I mention that because when we talk about these modernization issues, when it comes to staffing, pay, and the length of session, what we tend to see is a heavy reliance on lobbyists and special interest groups to inform our legislators on the issues that they should be paying attention to, how they should be supporting or opposing these issues, and overall what they are able to dedicate their very valuable time to during our short session length. And because they also are not paid, chances are that a lot of these issues are not giving attention to during that interim. So we at Common Cause, we recognize that if we don't have a legislature that represents the people. And here in New Mexico, we have a variety of diverse backgrounds, work and lived experiences, as Representative Rubio mentioned. Then are we really having a government that is for and by the people? That's a question that we have to ask ourselves. Something that hasn't been mentioned just yet is kind of a running commentary on this issue, is that legislators typically fall within a category of the 3 R's, which is rich, retired, and resourceful. And unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot of people who come from these different backgrounds, from the communities that could really use somebody who has their boots on the ground, who's lived in that community, who has the experience as someone who has a family, maybe a blue collar worker or a middle class citizen, to come up to Santa Fe and represent the people and the type of person that they are. And so what we would like to do when it comes to this, with this issue of modernization, of course, as you heard, increasing staff is extremely important. We've used a couple of tools as well when it comes to looking at this issue. So one, of course, is Dr. Krebs and Dr. Rocca's report. The report that Representative Rubio commissioned through UNMBR has also been very helpful for us to understand the opinions of the legislators on these issues as well. And Common Cause also did its own independent poll for through Thornburg, that was funded through Thornburg, on the public opinion on these issues as well, which I love to go over with you all. So I like to start this conversation by kind of this first statistic about what New Mexicans think legislators are paid. We would say, or our poll shows that 48% believe that our legislators are paid about $50,000 or above. And then 28% of that 48% believe that it's actually $75,000 above. Of the people that believe our legislators actually get paid, when we asked the question on if you understand what is your perception of legislator pay, only 2% were able to somewhat accurately say that they do not get paid. The 30% said they receive a per diem, but the other majorities believe that they actually already get paid a base salary. So like Representative Rubio mentioned, most common citizens in New Mexico actually believe that our legislators are going up, doing this work, and are being paid for it, when that actually is not the case. Now, when we go back to asking the question about what is your support, or what do you believe when it comes to actually paying legislators, 64% of the public would support doing exactly that. 62% would support doing that through an independent commission, compared to 72% saying that they would oppose legislators setting their own salary. In that same poll, we asked about the length of session. 70% also supported increasing the length of session. So this was actually a random sample of about 800 registered voters, and we saw this support pretty much cross bipartisan lines. The demographics covered all the different areas of New Mexico: north, southeast, west, southwest, northwest, and different age groups. And it was pretty consistent across support. Now, this last one I want to talk about, this last statistic, is about the direction of New Mexico, people's perceived direction of how New Mexico is doing. And as you can guess, 47% believe that we aren't doing so well. They were kind of off on the wrong track. And what we may say is that, well, you get what you pay for. And in which this case, we're not accurately or commensurately giving resources to legislators where they can have paid professional staff, where they have the appropriate amount of time in order to legislate and research these issues, and then they feel like they're being adequately compensated for these issues. So Representative Rubio talked about her bill, HJR 8, which would actually be a constitutional amendment if it was to make it all the way through. The other bill, HJR 2, for the increase of session length, would also be a constitutional amendment, meaning both would go to the voters if they were to make it all the way through both floors and then signed by the governor. So something that we saw interesting this year in comparison to last year's is that these bills actually had quite a bit of legs, particularly Representative Rubio's legislative salary bill. Similar bills have been suggested in the past, but there are a number of questions that come with this, right? Of course, the number one question that we get is how much is this going to cost? So, of course, if we are giving salary to legislators, there is going to be an increase of cost, and that just kind of is what comes with the territory, right? Another thing that we heard often is that I think somebody came off mute. Thank you. Another thing that we heard is about the parameters in which this independent salary commission will be held to. So some folks said that the salary should be tied to the median income of the New Mexican household, which is around $50,000 to $58,000. There was some argument that that salary should be proportionate to the work that the legislators are doing. If they're working in this professional setting, they should be paid a professional rate. The other issue that we hear about this particular issue, legislative salaries, is if we were to have an independent commission, would that be binding legislators to vote on that salary in the following year? And actually, there are about 16 states that have independent salary commissions. 5 of them have pretty much the same effect as law. So they create the salary in this independent commission, and then it goes into law. It gets signed into the legislator, signed into law in the next legislative session. And then the other 11 states that have an independent salary commission provide a recommendation in which the legislators vote on it. So that is something that we could potentially adopt here in New Mexico as well, with or without it being binding legislators to actually vote for that salary. I should note that in those legislatures that vote on the salary, they do have the ability to vote it down, in which the salary commission would have to go back and come back with a new recommendation. So I wanted to start off with this is because this issue, when it comes to salary, and we talk about representing New Mexicans and the people who are able to work in the legislature, has already had impact on legislators already. So I like to bring up a friend of mine who's a former legislator. Her name is former Representative Kay Bunka, and she was appointed to District 19, which is the international district here in Albuquerque. She was the first Asian American woman legislator, so something that hasn't happened in the history of New Mexico. And she was really only able to serve for one term. One, because she was already holding a full-time job. Two, she was a new mother, and she had her responsibilities to her family. And those two things mixed with not being paid, all of these additional responsibilities by being a legislator and her constituents' needs, we're really looking at this as if it's a full-time job if you're doing the job right. Now, some individuals, are perfectly fine with going up to Santa Fe once a year, doing the 30 or 60 days, and then going back to their, maybe their retirement or their full-time job or part-time job. Some are, really focused on putting food on the table for their families. And so when we talk about professionalizing a legislature, we're really talking about making sure that they have the resources that they need in order to give full dedicated attention to the constituents. Now, when it comes to the increase of session length, there's a number of reasons why we feel this is extremely important. The number one reason, I think, is because in that 30-day session, which we'll have in this upcoming year, is that bills are really only subject to the call of the governor. So we have this imbalance between the executive branch and the legislative branch on what bills can be heard 1 year out of the biennium, the 2 years in which we have legislative sessions. And so this bill that was introduced by Representative Figueroa would have increased this 30-day session to a 60-day session. We would have put a 5-day recess in the middle of session, which we heard from a lot of legislators would completely change the game, allow them to get a little bit of reprieve from the fast and furious nature of the session, and then also have some time to go back and review and research bills that have been brought up. and then come back with fresh bodies and fresh minds and continue that work. And then also we would eliminate that call of the governor where only bills that would be able to be considered germane during that 30-day session could be heard, with the exception of constitutional amendments. The other piece of this that I thought was particularly interesting in HJR 2 was that a bill would be able to be carried over. So oftentimes we see a bill not get enough time, right? Like Representative Rubio mentioned that her particular bill did not get a vote. With this in a Senate committee, this HJR for the increase of session length made it through two committees and didn't get a chance to be heard on the floor. So there was actually no debate on this topic further for a number of reasons, but if there was additional time, maybe that's something that could happen. And if it didn't happen in that session, without having to start the bill from scratch, it could be carried into that next session, and then we could continue to debate the topic, and it would give a bill more options to continue actually make it to the governor's desk. There's a number of reasons why this can be important to us as community members, as individuals, New Mexicans, because a lot of these bills, especially in the modern age that we live in now, are extremely complex. It's really difficult to vote on, say, an environmental bill or a gun bill without knowing all of the facts, and also while having to inform your peers and your colleagues on why they should be voting for this bill. And if you, as a legislator, are thinking about how this is going to affect your constituents, your area of New Mexico, where it can vary from where I am in Albuquerque to where Representative Rubio is in Las Cruces. These are things that we have to take in consideration, and that 60-day session and that 30-day session doesn't really allow for that to happen. And also because our legislators aren't paid, there isn't much incentive for them to do the work during that interim time, unless maybe the issue is discussed during interim. So right now, we're actually really excited to hear that modernization is being discussed during interim, actually. It has been brought up in Legislative Finance Committee for interim, and there will be a subcommittee to discuss paying our legislators, increasing session. And as you heard, the request for proposal for creating district offices and staffing has already been approved, and we are waiting on applicants, which we should hear back by the 28th of July. There will be somebody who is selected in order to complete that study, and we're looking forward to seeing the report that comes from that study in, say, October. And that may continue to help guide the conversation on the feasibility of these other two things, right? We give them resources for staffing so they can continue to do their work out in and outside of session. And then we can have a conversation on increasing the length of session and providing compensation for that, because we'll have all these pieces put into place. So I think when we're going through interim session, what we really are going to be looking for is legislators' understanding of this topic. Do they understand the fiscal responsibilities that come along with this? Do they understand the implications that it would have on the legislators themselves? Those who may not fall into the category of those 3 R's, right? Representative Rubio, I'm sure you work very hard every single day on top of your legislative duties. And like my friend, former Representative Vunca, who had a family, who worked a full-time job, maybe someone like that would be able to actually throw their hat into the ring, step away from their responsibilities in a full-time job capacity and focus only on being a legislator with a family in which they may provide a different vote than somebody who doesn't have those responsibilities. So that's some of the reasons why we are really closely looking at this topic. And right now we actually have an amazing group of different organizations that are also dedicated to working on this. And we meet once a month to discuss the progress of interim. And they've been actually working on this issue a little bit longer than I've actually been working for Common Cause. So I'm excited to work with them, with people like Representative Rubio and Professor Krebs on this. And we really think that this is a moment where New Mexicans could now finally have a legislature that is going to be able to properly and adequately represent them and handle these issues if we were to get some of these things passed. And I do see some questions coming into the chat, Scylla. So would we like to switch to Q&A or?
Yeah, I think this is a good time to switch over. I'll pin Professor Krebs as well. I know he has to log off sharply at 7 o'clock. So with respect to your time, Professor, we have first question in the chat from Jay. Jay, would you like to unmute and ask live?
Oh, sure. So the first question I had was, would maybe a system that attaches their pay to the average household income of New Mexico residents and maybe including a per diem, potentially just for like the mileage that they have to travel, would that be feasible? Because maybe that could help cover the financial impact that would affect legislators that live further away from the Capitol.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. That's a great question. So the legislation that we introduced initially for the constitutional amendment incorporated all of those recommendations. So we did want to give some guidance to the commission, but because the language would have to be on the ballot, we ended up removing it because we can't, so that way when I can't remember the name right now, but the word right now, but once the legislation is passed and it goes to the voters and the voters say yes or no, if they say yes, then the legislature itself can then start to make all of the necessary suggestions to the commission. And that was one of the recommendations that we had, was that not only should it be tied to the cost of living here in the state of New Mexico, or I think it was median income, but also that we would still be getting per diem. We didn't incorporate any type of like distance from, I don't believe we did, but yeah, definitely that is something that we've taken into consideration based on the research that we've done throughout the country, that we hope that once a commission is established, that they'll consider all of those things when establishing a salary. Enabling legislation, that's what I wanted to say. So once it's passed in the legislature and goes to the voters and they say yes, then we will come back to the session, do some enabling legislation, and provide that to the commission.
And I will jump in to say that here we already have independent salary commissions, particularly for the judicial branch. There's a judicial salary commission. The legislature does vote on the salaries for our judges. They are municipal and Supreme Court judges. And those salaries are typically tied to a percentage of what the federal rate is also. I don't know if that's something that we would want to look at for our legislators. I think something like the median or the individual income of the average New Mexican is something that's a lot more feasible to folks because, you know, we live in these communities. We have to work with people who may live at that median or below it. And so we want to be mindful of giving them a salary that reflects, you know, the people of New Mexico. So that's why we talk about the median household or individual income.
Thank you. I think our next question is from Clifford Reese, and then following that, we'll take a question from Alyssa.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Cliff Reese, Santa Fe, retired public health attorney, seasonal legislative staff since 2006. Representative Rubio, you just described the long process that it took to create the State Ethics Commission through constitutional amendment approved by the voters and then enabling legislation enacted in the following year. I'm wondering if there's a way for this process to be expedited given two specific factors. One, Democrats control the House, the Senate, and of course the governor's office. And two, money is really not an issue, at least currently. We are literally swimming in oil and gas money that's being put aside as surplus reserve that could be used for this process, even though, of course, it will be a recurring expenditure. Is there some way that, particularly with legislative leadership, to move this process faster than some of the other legislative reforms that many of us have dealt with in the past? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Clifford. I mean, my answer would be absolutely yes, it should be, but I think for folks who've been following the legislature for a while, is that even though we have Democrats that control the House and the Senate, we also have Democrats that don't act like Democrats. And so their values aren't necessarily aligned with mine as a Democrat. And so I think that that's one of the challenges that we face, is that I feel, even just from the Senate side, this last session, I had so many, I heard from more Republicans, or not more, but I think there was I feel like their minds are changing a little bit around this issue of paying a legislator. I saw that from Senator Burt in Roswell. He talked really openly in Senate Finance about having to hire a manager for the very first time in his life, because he's a small business owner, and the amount of constituent support he has to provide. Like, I think those are a lot of different experiences that legislators are facing. But I think the issue that we face within particularly a Democratic controlled House and Senate is that there are legislators who've been serving in the legislature for such a long time that they know how to navigate this entire process. And so we're also talking about people holding a lot of power. And when you have that kind of power, I think there's fear that with a paid legislature, that power will diminish. And so there's that, but then there's also the tradition. I mean, there are people who legislators who really truly believe that this is the way that it's a beautiful thing to be the only citizen legislature in the country, that they like to romanticize this entire system. And so I think those are the sort of challenges that we face with Democrats, is one, it's fear. The fear of the unknown, of having to do this without never having done it before. And then the romanticism of the system, but then also just the issue around power. I think those are the three things that I could think of that really keep people from wanting to move this process forward. Because it's a constitutional amendment, for folks who don't know, we don't actually have to have the governor's support on this. It just needs to pass the House and the Senate, and it goes straight to the voters. From what I understand, there is no opposition from our current governor. I don't know what other governors in the future will say about this issue, but in terms of it being a constitutional amendment, we don't need the governor to sign off on this. And in terms of the money, yes, we have the money. We've done scenarios in terms of if we were to pay legislators $50,000 up to $100,000 a year, and it would still be less than 1% of our total budget right now in the legislature. So we've put out all kinds of scenarios of what the cost would be, and it would still be a small significant amount of our state budget to pay for salaries for legislators.
And the governor needs to sign or pocket sign appropriations that would include the salaries for staff and for legislators. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I think our next question is coming from Alyssa.
Hi, thank you very much. I want to really thank the people that are championing this, particularly Rep. Rubio, for all the reasons that you stated. I'm a former Oregon legislator. I was there for 10 years. I moved here a couple years ago. I've been involved in the last 2 legislative sessions, and I've frankly been horrified at the lack of capacity, the structural capacity in the legislature. I was driving and I went through a little cell dead zone when Professor Krebs was speaking. And ironically, the only piece I missed was the positives on not paying, I think it was on not paying salaries. And I would love to follow up and find out what those positives were, because I don't see them. We had a 5-month session followed in the alternating year by a 5-week session. So both of them were longer. We had year-round fully paid staff who got paid more than legislators. We got paid $31,000. It was considered a half-time job. Our staff got paid more than that. And during the session, you could bring on at least 2 staff people, depending, you got a lump sum for your office. So depending on what level, how professional they were, and their salaries had to be set by a legislative staff, fiscal staff, to ensure equity. So you could have 2 to 2.5 people, or you could split it into 3 different ways. So, I am strongly in favor of this. I would love to help in any way. I think my questions are, first, it seems to me, I did talk to a lot of legislators. I did find some of the longtime higher place legislators were more reluctant than people like Rep. Rubio. That was very frustrating to see. I think for all the reasons that she stated. I do think there was a big argument about, we're really worried that if we have longer sessions and don't get the pay. And so I wonder if frankly, I think you need at least a 3-month in the long session and then a 2-month. So I was a little disappointed to see the proposal only be 2 months and 2 months. And I heard that one of the big arguments for that was because you weren't sure that the pay was going to get through. So I wonder if you can put the pay on the ballot first, and then really re-examine how long what the ideal session would be. There's some advantage to putting everything together, obviously, in terms of running a campaign, but there's also some disadvantage, because if you say in the campaign, we have the shortest sessions in the country, it kind of counteracts the argument to pay. So I think you can cut that both ways. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that NCSL, which is the National Conference of State Legislators, did a huge front page, front of their magazine and full article on how different legislatures do their salaries. And their very high recommendation was to do an independent commission that would have the final say and not have to have approval from the legislature. So anyway, just, the question in all that was, can you do the pay first and take away some of the arguments from legislators? And then really consider a length of session that I would hope would be more than 2 months and 2 months.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Alyssa. The strategy going into the session was that we were only going to introduce the legislation on salaries. That had been a decision that we made as a cohort. But as the weeks got closer to the start of the session and some of the conversations that other legislators were having with other legislators, it felt like it was just necessary to introduce both. I think that in the end, what we experienced with the length of the legislature expanding that, that was the hardest legislation to get over any obstacles. I think part of it had to do with a number of different reasons, but I think ultimately people just aren't ready to talk about lengthening legislative sessions. And so that's going to be part of some discussion over the course of the next few years. I don't see that legislation really making it bar next session. I think there's still a lot of issues that legislators have with that. And so we'll see what happens. But in terms of the 60-day session, that was based on just conversations that we had with the entire, with as many legislators that we had. So it didn't have anything to do with whether or not we would get it passed. It was already based on the research that we did over the course of the year, that we knew 45-day sessions weren't going to work. We knew that I personally have always wanted 2 45-day sessions a year, but that wasn't something that everybody was in support of. And so we just kind of went into this idea of like, well, what if we just extended the 30-day into a 60-day and go from there. And so that's pretty much how we came to that.
And Professor Krebs, I know you have to log off soon, but did you want to address Alyssa's question about the positives of having the unpaid staff, right? Or unpaid?
You can, if you just put your email and phone number in there, that'd be great, because I know everyone else heard it and it was my 10
I don't
second
know.
dead zone.
Did I say something that was positive about not paying?
Said there were pros and cons, and then you started listing the pros right as I went into a dead zone. I came out of that dead zone pretty quickly, so I don't think there were a lot of pros, but I don't see any.
You know, it's really, again, I think the bottom line with regards to salary is that sort of the direct effect of salary as a component of profession.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it.
The direct effect of salary as a component of professionalization, those are not as clear. The impact that paying legislators has on legislative capacity, that's not as clear as the impact that we see from staff and extending the time in session. You know, and so what salary does do, what we have found in the literature at least, is it affects who runs at a time, it affects the time that they spend on the job, that legislators spend on the job. It has been shown to have a sort of a direct effect on some good government reforms. So there are some direct effects associated with positive ones, I think, but the overall impact on legislative capacity is not as significant, is not as powerful as we see for staffing. And
So can I respond to that? I know you did a big literary research on that. I would just say intrinsically, I feel that the salary is really important, not only in terms of increased representation and the kind of people who can serve, but also in doing the job itself. Because if you do have full year, year-round staff, you need to be able to oversee those staff. And that was one of the reasons that I heard Mimi Stewart say she was struggling with some of this, is because it's really hard to oversee staff. And so she was having some problems with having more staffing for people when they were not in a position to really well supervise them. So I would just say all of these things kind of really work together. It's hard to separate them kind of individually.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you on that. But you know, in terms of again, the overall impact on capacity, we don't see as strong an effect, but we do argue and have recommended that, you know, salary is just something that we ought to pay on legislators. It's the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. We shouldn't ask people not to be paid for their labor. And so then there's details around whether it's full-time, how full-time is it? Is it year round? How does the salary of the legislator relate to the full-time staff? And all those questions are to be resolved, but I don't disagree with anything that you said. And thank you for that question.
I'll just add one more thing from Oregon, is that our salary was 31,000, and 3 very powerful women who were chairs of committees happened to be committees that were all dealing with vulnerable populations. One was early childhood, one was human services, one was housing. All quit the legislature in Oregon because Oregon chose not to increase the salary from 31,000. So it just shows, you know, women having to pay for childcare while they're going down to Salem. So it's an ongoing struggle. And when I came here, knowing that struggle, I was shocked to see that people didn't get anything here.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about that too is that, you know, what we have in New Mexico is we do have, even though the legislature is unpaid, we have a large percentage of women serving in the legislature, and we have a very diverse legislature. And so, I mean, if we wiped it all away and we started from scratch, we would have a much different, you know, we had a full-time professionalized legislature. We'd probably have some different outcomes on that front. But we, you know, so our status quo moving forward, we say, well, incumbents are going to be advantaged. Our status quo, that means that, you know, the people who are currently serving, this good mixture of women and people of color, that's going to be preserved, that they're going to have. But what's interesting from the salary standpoint is the effect it has on people who are just like, I can only do this so long, and otherwise I'm tapping out unless I can support myself more effectively doing this role. And that's, I think, in the future we'll start seeing these, or maybe we see it right now. You got certain people who can just hang on for a very long time, and very effective legislators who just are going to tap out early because they're not retired, they've got families, they've got regular day jobs, all those kinds of things. I think it's going to be really important as we head into the future. It's important right now, but it'll be increasingly on display, I think, as we move forward.
I would just also add to that the reason, and I won't speak to the Senate because I don't think it's as diverse as it should be, but I will say that the House is very diverse. We have elected the most, we are a majority women in the House of Representatives, and we have to give credit to Speaker Egolf at the time and Speaker Martinez now, that we got a lot of support from Speaker Egolf, as well as now Speaker Martinez, regarding they have staff within their leadership that lend it out to those of us in serving in the legislature. So there's that piece, but then we also have Emerge New Mexico, which has worked really hard for a very long time to elect women to run for office. There's just networks within our state that have allowed for many of us to be able to continue this work, because believe me, this is my 7th year, but I was ready to leave after my first term. Mason talked about Representative Bunka and how she only served her 1 term. The same with Representative Barrera. She left after her 2nd year. So it's like, so there are people who are actively considering their future within the legislature because we are an unpaid legislature, and that, I think, is a crisis that we need to address. And many of us do have a sense of urgency to get this done. And Sandra in the chat talks about how shameful it is that Democrats don't believe in paying people for their work. And yes, absolutely. Like this is, people talk about New Mexico, that we have been a majority Democratic state for decades. But the difference is that we have a lot of conservative Democrats, and those are the people that we need to work towards pushing to address this issue as a priority.
I've got to run. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. And I just love this conversation. And thanks so much for your participation and feedback and everything else. So have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Krebs.
All right, bye-bye.
I have a quick question for you guys. How has House and Senate leadership been in terms of this topic? Have they been supportive? Have they, kind of changed their minds? Do you think that they will be supportive in the near future? And will that, influence the life cycle of these bills?
I mean, I'll speak for our House leadership. Speaker Martinez, the day that the session ended, committed to creating a subcommittee for the interim, and we have that right now with the Senate, with the legislative finance. This is a priority for him coming into the next session. I know that with conversations that I've had with Senator Worth, he's committed to this issue. He wants this to happen. I know that we had conversations with Senator Stewart last year. I don't know what's happening with her now after this last session, because I feel like some of the tone changed from last summer to this last session. So I think there's a lot of work to do with the Senate, and this is conversations that I've had with Mason and folks that are part of the coalition, that in preparation for the session in January, A lot of outreach needs to be done to the Senate specifically, because I think with the House, we're fine in the House. I think we can push it through as quickly as possible. It's really the Senate to trying to convince senators to not deviate from what we've already been working on. I mean, it's clear the poll that Common Cause has done, the studies that have been done, the study that NCSL has done that Alyssa was talking about, it is clear that people would prefer a commission to make this decision around salaries. That legislation is here, we have it, let's pass it, and not deviate from what we've already been working on over the course of the last few years.
And I will say that I think right now we're in a situation where this topic is becoming more and more unavoidable, right? And when it, like Representative Rubio mentioned, in the Senate, it is not as diverse as the House, right? So they don't see things like the salaries being as important because it may not affect them as well. And also because those individuals who held positions of power for a long time, I mean, there are fewer seats in the Senate as well. So they probably don't want, additional competition to come and challenge them for their seat if something like a salary was to be implemented, and if an increase of session length was to be implemented as well, if they have to do additional work in Santa Fe each year. And then also the additional work that comes with being out of session because you're getting paid a salary and there's the expectation that you are making this your full-time job, which is all of our expectation, right? Because we elect these individuals and we want them to do their job and represent us. So the challenge is there in the Senate, but it is starting to shift. The conversation is. So I think that we have a really good shot at getting through to Senate leadership, particularly getting through to leadership in those really important committees. The two we went through last year was Senate Rules and Senate Finance, where it didn't actually get a vote, like Representative Rubio mentioned. And the chair of Senate Finance, Senator Munoz, he is a Democrat, he is a conservative one, and he does not entirely support this issue. But I think when we start having these conversations in interim, giving all the facts that have come from these reports, from our findings, and that we see in other states, that could also change, especially if he has a majority support from their colleagues. I think I saw someone raise their hand. Was it Michael? Maybe it wasn't. Sorry, I called you up there. You may have left.
Yeah, I see some people are logging off as the time is passing. We do still have some time if people have questions. This is a very exclusive opportunity to ask these questions, especially with a state representative here joined with us. So please take the opportunity. Alyssa, go ahead.
Okay, great. I'm sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions, but if no one else is piping up, I wonder how much of a plan there is in place with pledging of resources to run a campaign if this did get through the legislature to make sure that it passes the ballot this time around.
So I can speak to that actually, because when we were in Senate Rules, that was something that Senator Duhigg had brought up, what the public education piece is going to be on this. Right now there's a lot of earned media going around currently. There's actually just an article in the Journal, I think, when it was in regards to this issue, and we heard support and a little bit of dissent for this. But Common Cause will conduct a public education campaign if this does make it through. The only thing is that we can't start that campaign until we know what's going to be on the ballot. Our education right now is solely to the legislators, and of course we don't need much funding for that except my salary maybe. And then when we involve the public in this, it's kind of more of an awareness because it's not on the ballot yet. But once it does get an opportunity to be on the ballot, Representative Rubio and the members of her cohort did a lot of work to make sure that the language was cut down so it can fit on the ballot, because every word of the HJR needs to fit on the ballot as well. So there's a lot of information that goes into there. So we'll probably take on the responsibility of doing that with funding that we would receive as well.
I would also add that there are organizations statewide as well as national organizations that are very interested in this issue from a democracy standpoint in terms of including more people in the process that not necessarily have committed funding, but we believe will commit as soon as we get it passed.
Thank you both. I see Cliff has his hand up.
Just a quick comment, and we don't have time to really discuss this tonight. Understandably, we've focused a great deal on the constitutional amendments and on the appropriations, on statutes that can be passed that can modernize the legislature. But there's at least two other areas of change that can be done without going through either of those processes. One is through rule changes of the House and Senate, or joint House Senate changes. They don't go to the governor, they go through the committee process, particularly around the committee process itself, which has been a real issue for many advocates. And then lastly, there's administrative changes that can be made with existing resources if the leadership, as we've discussed, directs the Legislative Council Service, for instance, or the other two year-round legislative staffs to make changes in their process. And the last thing I'll say is, if we increase the length of the session, we impact the interim process, and there will need to be at some point a real hard look at the interim process. I particularly am interested in seeing more year-round legislative committees created in addition to the three we already have. Particularly in my own background, I'd like to see a year-round legislative health and human services committee, since as we've learned recently, pandemics don't conveniently happen during legislative sessions. And so we need year-round expertise and oversight. And then also, I'm sorry, the very last thing, we need long-term planning. And that's the thing that has always struck me. We very much go from crisis to crisis, year to year budgets. We need some really good people who can look down the road 5-10 years and create roadmaps to help us get there. So anyway, just some final thoughts from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I see Claudia has a hand up as well.
Hi, thanks. And I'm so sorry I joined late. I had this in at 7 instead of 6, so I probably missed the bulk of it, but I'm very familiar with the legislation. My question is about the stakeholders who have such a strong vested interest in keeping the system the way it is. There are a number of legislators. I don't think the governor, probably supports this. There are a lot of people that want to keep it the way it is. So how do you address and influence those stakeholders enough to change their mind to change the system?
You vote them out. I mean, that's all I can. That's my only answer at this point. I think there have been a lot of conversations that I have had personally with legislators over the course of the last 7 years that privately they will not, privately they support, but publicly they don't. They're afraid to take public votes that pay any type of compensation to a politician. And so I think that's part of and you probably missed that conversation, is that there's a level of accountability that comes with this issue. You as voters need to talk to your legislators and inform them of what a disservice this issue is for many of the constituents in our communities. I think people will continue to either their hearts and minds will change over time, hopefully in the next 6 months. But if they haven't changed their mind in 7 years and they haven't in 6 months, then that's a conversation that needs to be had in terms of accountability, where legislators are straight up not representing their communities adequately. And we've seen it with other issues that have come up in the past where legislators went against what many of their constituents believes in, and there's consequences for that. And as an organizer myself who believes in building power from within our community, that's I mean, there's demands that have to be made, and if and this is one of them.
Okay, thank you.
So I will just say on that issue, and I had to laugh because I definitely don't disagree with Representative Rubio, but it's something that I give a lot of thought to, especially in my role in interacting with legislators and hearing from them in committee about how differently it can be perceived. Now, I don't know if the governor's support is really like the most important thing that we need right now, because our governor, in terms of the relationship between her and the legislators on this issue, doesn't have a lot of power. Her salary gets voted on by legislators as well, so it's kind of a catch-22 because she's not going to have the reverse effect. But when we think about the individuals who are in power right now and their opinion on it, I'll give two examples from both sides of the aisle. And I think it was House Judiciary, Democratic Representative Alcone said he would not vote on this issue because he, at one point, was cited in the news as being the most paid legislator because he, I believe, is retired, so he had the ability to attend the most interim committees. So that resulted in him being paid the most, and he argued that it gave off a negative press and potentially affected his election that year, although he got reelected, because this was an issue that involved salaries and his particular salaries. In that interim and others, we hear about the conversation of having paid politicians, or not paid politicians, career politicians, so people who get into the work just in order to receive a salary or receive income, right? And if this type of bill would enable that, which I would argue that it doesn't. In the Senate Finance Committee, while we heard from Republican Senator Crystal Diamond, where she said this type of legislation would be a benefit to her being a single mother, and it's already extremely difficult having a full-time job, balancing her family, and serving as a legislator. I believe she is the senator for a rural district, so it may be very specific, way that she interacts with her constituents there. But this type of bill, she, may be supportive of because it's going to directly affect her and her ability to legislate. Now, what we've seen even recently, and it's not, out of the norm for legislators and parties to vote along party lines, but if someone like Senator Crystal Diamond could support this type of issue in a committee as a Republican, although we may not expect her to vote for it on the Senate floor because she may need to side with her party on this issue, that could be, a win in itself. But these are conversations that we do need to have. But people like Representative Alcone, who we know just aren't budging, like Representative Rubio said, it's not worth the time, and we'll need to have maybe further intervention from somebody in his district, a constituent or a colleague, who could possibly change his mind, or we could just expect him not to.
Well, and sorry to interrupt, but I think he ended up voting for it in the House, like on the floor. I'll have to go back and check, but he ended up voting for it. Yeah.
So it's still another party line type of scenario, right? So we can expect him to vote in the House, but he's going to be outspoken about it. It's always like this when it comes to issues of money. It's just unavoidable.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I mean, I was also at the Capitol quite a lot this year, and I also recognized when certain people would vote against a bill in the committee, but because that's not publicly accessible information, once that bill made it to the floor, they were kind of forced into, voting in favor of those policies. So it's just, there's a lot of different levels to, how the legislature works. And I think this is one of the key important areas. I see Alyssa put in the chat that one of the proposed changes was to let bills that have had hearings go into the second year, like the US Congress, and how that would save a lot of time to skip going through the same all over again. And as you guys know, right, we introduce bills every single year, and we just keep doing that until they pass. And I think that would be a really good addition if it were to be considered, to kind of mimic the US Congress in allowing to do that.
And that was probably the least popular piece of everything.
And I think it's totally a workaround when the other things are way more important. But when you have a 1-month session and a 2-month session, I think it's a workaround that's worth considering. It allows you to pick up where you left off. I was shocked at how fast these hearings went through. We were never allowed to have a vote on a bill in its first hearing. We always had to have a public session and then schedule a public session / work session. And when you have a work session, that indicates that it's possible to take a vote. And in this legislature, everything is crammed through so fast. And so legislators hear a little bit of testimony, not much, and then they vote on a bill. It's just like such an incredibly poor way of doing public policy. And so my thought on that particular one was, if you're going to get stuck with these really short sessions, then at least don't have the recurring conversations by the same committee. Now, I know that Speaker Martinez was not in favor of this, and his reasoning was that there might be changes on the committee. And I think you could make a rule that said, if any more than 2 people are newly assigned in the interim to a committee, because that occasionally happens, then the bill has to be fully heard again. I mean, there's something that you could do to address that. Or if the vote was not, a certain percentage, its first time around, then it had to have a hearing again in the next year. But I do think the carryover makes a lot of sense, only because it's such ridiculously short session. So the other proposals on the table are far better.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's advocates that were opposed to that because of the fact that things have just become so polarized that there are pieces of legislation that are scary to a lot of communities who are living on the margins, especially, that could potentially keep getting heard. And so that's just something that needs to be further discussed. But it wasn't just from legislators, but it was from advocates as well.
But my understanding is it can only skip a committee if it had passed the year before. So some of the really scary minority party views would not be something that would be allowed to go forward. It has to have passed a committee. So anyway, I'd love to explore that more, but really it shouldn't take a lot of energy because we should be focused on the more substantive improvements.
All right. Well, seeing that we're close to the end of our time here, I first of all really want to thank all of our speakers here, Representative Rubio, Mason, and Professor Krebs, for taking your time and volunteering to be speakers for us today. I do want to let the rest remaining of 14 people on this call know that what you can do today is Common Cause has launched a petition. I'm putting the link in the chat. If you have not signed it, please sign it. It shows public support for this issue, and it's very, very important to all of our communities. With that, do you guys have any closing remarks, Representative and Mason?
I guess I'll just say that I will also drop into the chat our website for this modernization initiative. And here we have just some information on exactly what we talked about, those 3 pillars of modernization and what they mean, and currently New Mexico's current standing as a citizen legislature, and why we want to change that. So I'll put that in the chat. If you could sign a petition, that would be helpful. It's always good to have numbers public support for these types of issues. And I just want to give a shout out to Representative Rubio for being so amazing and bringing this legislation forward every year, working with our coalition, and being such an amazing advocate for this. So Representative, really, we applaud you, and I really enjoy having the honor of working with you on this.
Thanks, Mason. And I don't have much to say other than just for if you folks can just please reach out to your legislators and please just have a conversation about where they're at with this issue. And last, I mean, as soon as this legislation passes, I can leave the legislature. That's always been my thing, is that as soon as this passes, I can finally go away. So let's pass it as soon as possible. So
That's a disincentive for us. We need you for more than just this.
thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Again, thank you all so much for being here and taking the time, and thank you to our speakers. And we hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.